Okay, we're discussing this idea of release to ministry. Are ministry gifts truly given to everyone? Are they part of meeting Jesus? When we meet Jesus, does he release us to serve him? I believe the Bible is telling us very clearly that ministry is something that happens in all of us when we meet Jesus. It's meant to be there just as much as salvation is something that happens in an instant. Well, I believe ministry, the release to serve God, is something that happens instantly upon meeting Jesus. Here's another example. One of the most interesting ones of all. It's in the book of Acts chapter 9. Now I'm sure you're very familiar with this and this story, and so I'm not going to read all the beginning of the story, but I am going to zero in on the part that talks about being released to ministry. Acts chapter 9 tells us about a fellow named Saul. Now we know him as Paul later, but he's called Saul here. Now at the beginning of the chapter, Saul, it says, was breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. Okay, that's what it says in Acts chapter 9, verse 1. He was a fellow who was going to go to Damascus, and he was going to put the Christians in Damascus in prison and torture them and hurt them and do some bad stuff. He was certainly an enemy of Christians, wasn't he? Now we know the story. He meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he says, Lord. He accepts him. He becomes a Christian, doesn't he? But what happens? He becomes blind, doesn't he? Right? Now, what happens to Saul after that? Well, he goes to Damascus, and there's a fellow named Ananias, okay? Now, Ananias is a very interesting fellow in itself, because it says that this fellow Ananias is just a disciple. He's just a regular person, a student, in the church at Damascus. But if you notice something, well, we'll talk about this in a moment, but what happens is Ananias comes and prays for Saul, but Jesus talks to Ananias and says, go pray for Saul and pray that he'll recover his sight. And he does this. Then it says he immediately baptizes, he gets baptized, okay? And he says he receives the Spirit. So again, all of these things are happening one after another. He gets saved, he gets healed, he gets baptized into the Spirit. Now again, let's go back to Luke chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. See, some people might say, well, Jesus, when he was physically here, could release the demoniac or release the blind man, but now that he's not physically here, these things don't happen anymore. Well, this story happened after Jesus was resurrected and ascended to heaven. The Jesus that Saul met is the same Jesus that you and I have met. Isn't it true? Isn't he the same yesterday, today, and forever? So anyway, he gets saved, healed of his blindness, baptized in the Spirit. Okay, and then it says the most interesting thing in verse 19. This is Acts chapter 9, verse 19. And when he, Paul, had received meat, now he got healed, baptized in the Spirit, baptized into Christ. When he received meat, he was strengthened. Then Saul was certain days with the disciples which were at Damascus, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. That's the release to ministry, isn't it? People will often read that part. But Paul immediately began preaching. He just spent a few days talking with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he went out and preached the gospel. Now, a lot of people say, well, that was St. Paul, or what, are you crazy? We don't do things. I believe these things are in the New Testament not as rulership things or things we should just sit and be amazed at, but things that we should take on as an example. And it's a simple example. All the other parts of it we take on as an example. Do you witness the gospel to people, and have you ever seen that they can get saved? Have you ever prayed for the sick and seen them get better? I have, and I know many of you have as well. Have you ever released someone to serve God by coming in for a few days and letting them straightway preach the gospel? That often doesn't happen in the system of church that tradition has given us. Isn't that true? But let's take a look at this. In Paul's case, he immediately is released to serve God. Now, I believe this is a perfect example of that release to ministry that Jesus talked about in Luke chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. He says he came to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. This is exactly what happens to Paul. He meets Jesus and literally straightway preaches the gospel. Again, this is the spirit of release, which I've been talking about throughout the New Testament. This is a New Testament change, by the way. In the Old Testament, a prophet was something that happened very rarely, and only one tribe of Israel was allowed to be in the ministry, the Levites. And in the Old Testament, there was only the high priest could go into the presence of God. Paul is later going to write about how the New Testament changes those things and that all believers can go into the presence of God. So since we can all go into the presence of God, when Jesus was on the cross, the veil of that temple was torn from top to bottom. The presence of God now dwells in man. In the Old Testament, they couldn't receive the Spirit the way Paul immediately did. They couldn't be baptized immediately. They couldn't receive all of these things. And, of course, they couldn't receive the idea of being in ministry immediately, because ministry was a kind of authority over others, okay? Now, the question that I bring about, and just to say this, but I believe the reason we don't see this happen or have that straightway release to ministry happen is because we have a different definition of ministry. We think ministry is authority over others. Why do we think that? Because we have a church service that shows us that week after week after week. And we have a function that shows us that ministry is something for 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 500 or 1 out of 10,000 people to have. In fact, rather than ministry being in everyone, isn't it true that in the system of church that we have through the common church service, success is to have more people who are not ministers under the authority of one person who is a minister? In other words, if someone's a successful minister, they have authority over lots of other people, and all those people are non-ministers. They don't really serve God. They're not really a pastor or a prophet or teacher or apostle or so on, or whatever words we want to call those folks. Isn't it interesting how the system of church has taken us so far away from this directness and simplicity that's in the New Testament? And by doing that, I think we've missed one of the aspects of the gospel, this release to serve God that Jesus himself said was part of his ministry, that he demonstrated, and in fact happened while he was ministering in the earth and after he was ministering in the earth. You see? So, take a look at this example and study it in the Bible and take a look carefully at this, because I think this is a very important example of being released straightway to preach the gospel. And I want to ask you about, do you think this could happen in your church? Do you think these things that happened to Paul in this chapter could happen in your church and the system of churches that we see around us today? Again, we're going to study history in a little while, and we're going to look into why people in many years ago changed the system. And they changed the system so much that these things can very well, it's very difficult for this to happen. I want to go to this church in Damascus because those folks were laying hands on the sick and praying for people, receiving the Spirit, baptizing people immediately, and sending them out to preach the gospel if that's what God wanted them to do straight away. So, I believe the New Testament tells us that gifts of ministry are given to every one of us and should be common and should be a flow amongst all believers. They should be encouraged and released wherever possible. The folks at Damascus probably looked at Saul and said, hey, he had been a very learned man in the Old Covenant. He had been, I believe, a Pharisee, and he knew a lot about the Old Covenant. They probably just had to aim him in the right direction and say, look, Jesus is the Messiah. And everything that he knew about the Messiah came into his mind, and he went, oh yeah, now I could go preach this, because now I know who the Messiah is. It's Jesus Christ. And you know the Messiah too, don't you? You should be preaching the gospel too, straightway. And when you meet other believers, you should encourage them to carry the gospel just in the same manner, quickly, directly, with whatever gifts and abilities and talents they have. And we should work together on these things even better. So, this is what I call the straightway release to ministry, and it's in the New Testament, whether anybody wants it to be or not. It's in there many times, and it's intrinsic to the gospel. And people met Jesus, they went right away and were released to serve God. That's because ministry is a gift given to everyone.